Also, Mark's thesis was I eat ass, and he was right. I do.
Marx
was right. I eat ass. He was correct.
Negras tormentas agitan los aires y nubes.
Greetings, listeners, siblings, friends, comrades, workers of the world, and welcome to the third installment of Kropotse-Tung. I'm here again with my Maoist comrade, known only by the alias of Mao Trash.
Hello, I am Mao Trash.
And so just some announcements real quick. We are now on Soundcloud and iTunes under the obvious title of Kropotse-Tung, where you should find us there and subscribe. And yeah, that's about it. We're a little bit late with this episode due to the inauguration of Donald Trump, but yeah, you'll just have to deal with it.
Suck it up, Buttercup.
So we didn't get a lot of follow-up for this episode, and or the last episode. Last episode didn't do as well as the first one for some reason. But we do have a little. I found this one comment that I haven't looked a lot at, but it's on like the first episode. I don't know if we should bring that up or if we should stick to stuff relating to base and superstructure.
What's the comment?
It says, it's so weird, he says, anarchy is only an idea with no tactics or strategy to get to an end. No final tangible structure. This is framing it wrong. The abolition of anything like a known semblance of government, militaries, and police, as they have thus far functioned, requires the process. So anarchy is a function. You could think of it like that. It is the breaking of structures. The very process of leveling the playing field is anarchy. Organizational behaviors is a biological principle that coincides, therefore, with evolution. But look, chemistry, math, but psychology as well. Organizational behavior is why clay... I don't know. I'm really not sure what he's saying.
Clay.
Or what they are saying. The end of the comment by saying, all
like
you gotta do is punch a fascist in his fucking face.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, you should.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely should. I don't see how that really relates to anything we said in the episode. But yeah, I think what this person is kind of saying is that anarchism does have some sort of structure, framing, or whatever. I'm unsure as to what this person means.
Yeah. So, if I understand what he's saying correctly, he's basically saying, no, we actually do analyze the current society in the process of trying to put in the one that we want. And I'm not saying that they don't. Like, if they wanted to have any revolutionary movement whatsoever, they would be forced to do that, and they have been, and so they do. That's not necessarily what I was trying to get at when I was explaining my perspective on, like, where I disagree with anarchism. Particularly what I meant by that was that the actual ideas of what society should look like is not rooted in where we are now or where history has been.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, of course, if there's to be a revolutionary movement or trying to build a new society at all, then yes, you're going to take into account where you are. But that's not fundamentally the root of where you're trying to go. Whereas with Marxists, where we are now and analyzing where we are now is the root of what we use to try and analyze pushing forward.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, I mean, neither of us ever said that anarchism doesn't have an analysis. What we said was that the analysis that anarchism does have is severely lacking, and in a lot of times not at all unified, because like there are several very very different anarchist analyses, even though they all kind of boil down to the same broad ideas. I think that's one thing that kind of separates Marxism and anarchism, because even though there's a large amount of variations on Marxism, it is all based on the same basic idea. And when it comes to anarchism, it's supposed to be kind of, or it is supposed to be, but along the way a lot has been changed or like twisted or misinterpreted. So I feel like we have to mention the anarcho-communism group, because we have in every episode so far, and it would be wrong not to.
It would be a break in tradition.
Yeah, we're very strict on our traditions here at Kropotse-Tung. So yeah, I'm gonna start with this. I have one more thing that I want to mention from that, which I know I'm pretty sure you saw as well, but this is one thread that I saw, and it kind of relates to base and superstructure, or rather class reductionism, and or like the lack of class analysis in some cases on the opposite end.
Identity reductionism.
Yeah, that's a word that very much fits. So we had this person who said basically anarchists, mainly white anarchists, focus too much on class, or not that they focus too much on class, but he was or they were talking about the word bourgeoisie specifically, and how they don't like it being used, because it's not that they thought it was like a scapegoat, but they thought that instead of looking at this ruling class, this exploiting class, you should look at what this person thought causes classes. And they said that this was racism, which I think is, I mean, racism has existed for a lot longer than capitalism, but I think you can't really say that racism necessarily created.
I wouldn't say that racism is as old as classes. I would actually say that racism is a pretty new thing, because race itself is somewhere around 500 years old.
Mm.
Race started with the colonization of the Western Hemisphere, of the Americas.
Yeah.
Particularly in the English colonies, although the Spanish colonies also developed their own forms as time went on. However, to say that this is the source of class is pretty ahistorical, because societies that have not interacted with any other society have still formed class. This is so what causes class is natural developments in human society. That, okay, so if you look at tribal society, for example, generally over time, things start to become like classes start to form a little bit, where it's like, okay, so not everyone can do literally everything, so we need to figure out how we're going to distribute things. Well, let's have an elder. An elder was a popular way to do it. You would have an elder be like, okay, give me all your shit, I'm gonna distribute it. And that's not particularly class-like, because everyone's going to become an elder eventually. Well, I guess not everyone at the time, because people died a lot. But nonetheless, it wasn't particularly class-like.
Yeah.
And as that formed, as society would form more,
and you could say that
like agriculture would develop, and you couldn't just have everyone.
You could say
doing
like
their own.
That the elder position is a sort of meritocracy based on like the most amount of experience.
Yeah, it sort of developed into that a little bit. So that's where we started to see like some of the emergence of class in human societies. And so with the development of advanced agriculture uh, over time, and I say advanced, but I don't mean like now. I mean
Yeah.
like the first agriculture that existed, really. Um, as that developed, it became clear that it wouldn't necessarily make sense to just have everyone farming for themselves, because then they're not going to. In some cases, each development worked differently, but in some cases it was like, oh, well, then people are just going to, when they only work for how much they need, then things like shortages are a big possibility. So some of the more powerful people in the tribal societies would start to own shit, and in some cases you could say that that I wouldn't call this racism. I just call this territorial disputes, where as you took land and conquered from other societies, you would use the people from the other societies as slaves. Because like, hey, not only we gonna take your land, but you're gonna work on this land and basically make life cool for us. Yeah. And so that's sort of where you start to see the emergence of slave societies. So you'll see that slave societies start to sort of develop around the same time that tribal societies sort of die off. So that's why many of the earliest civilizations were all based in slavery. Like the majority of people were slaves. Like the Greek, for example, the Greek democracy was democracy for slave owners, and the majority of people were slaves. In Rome, I think it was something like maybe 5% of people weren't slaves. The vast majority of people were slaves. And in the Philippines, slaves sort of began pretty early on, right around the time that earlier than the Spanish colonizers would come and take shit over. But slave society started to develop around that time. Peasants were still the majority. I think slaves were around 15%. So, this can vary time to time, but nonetheless, it's a pretty constant trend that we can see, that slavery with the development of tribal society is most of the time pretty much that's what's going to happen next.
Yeah. And slavery tends to develop into feudalism. Yeah.
And so that's how we get to where we are now. So I would say that it's wrong to say that like racism is the source of class. It upholds it, but it is not the source.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The thing is with this post that the result of this was a bunch of self-righteous white anarchists commenting on it and screaming about how they're not racist and they're fighting racism. So there's no good side to this.
Oh Lord.
Like
yeah, so one just has a bad class analysis, the other is just shitty.
Yeah.
Yeah, so white anarchos, white radicals in general, white people, stop that.
Yeah, really do fucking stop that.
Like, especially for the ones that are American, because, fam, you're on stolen land. I'm sorry, but the way that you grew up, you're going to be racist. Yeah. Unless you're, like, on the level of breaking Asada Shakur out of jail. For those of you who don't know, that is a thing that the best of white people in U.S. history have done. The very best of white people in history, next to, like, John Brown and shit. Those two people aren't racist. But, I mean, they also pretty much died for the cause of Black and Indigenous liberation. So, unless you're at that point, I would strongly consider the fact that since you are on stolen land in a very racist society where its economy is entirely based on the theft of labor from Africans and land from Indigenous people, put that into perspective and think about how you may actually not be as nice as you think you are.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's I don't know how much authority I have on this topic as a white person who is also a potential settler on Sapmi land, but I would say that it's like you're pretty much gonna have like inherent from the society you're living in. You're gonna develop inherent racist ideas and behaviors, and it's important to recognize these so that you can counteract them in a way.
Mhm.
That's one of the things we talked about that in an old thing we did way back when you were still an anarchist.
Oh man, those were the days, weren't they?
Yeah, that was the precursor to Kropotse-Tung, that one video. So yeah, let's see. We have just one more thing. The person in the ANCOM group who thinks he knows everything about Marxism and called us tankies. Did you see that thread?
I did.
What was your reaction on that?
Okay, so basically this guy was trying to say that the difference between tankies and non-tankies was any idea that there would be a program of socialism different from communism. But with the way that he was describing it, he was essentially calling every anarchist project in history tanky.
Oh yeah, that's the interesting part. That's what I find interesting about like early critiques of platformism as well, as they're basically just screaming, "This is the transitionary period," about how the revolution will be like conducted. Mm-hmm. That's their only critique. Like, this is not communism yet. You have not achieved full communism.
Yeah, and so that's like when we go back into like idealism and shit, is that it doesn't authentically analyze where you are as the guiding force forward.
Yeah.
Instead, says, why haven't you organized society completely differently in a day? The fuck's wrong with you? Because like in early Catalonia, we can see that there were still classes. The peasants still existed, separate from the workers.
Yeah.
And there were still landlords for a time. They ended up like not staying too long, but nonetheless they did exist. Exploitative brothels existed for a while, which again would later be abolished, but they did exist for a while. And there were definitely things that developed that were not done 100% democratically. That's just the way that it went. And rightfully so, given that they were in a war. It's a little bit difficult to conduct polls and shit all the time around a society of something like 4 million when the territory that 4 million occupies is constantly changing.
Yeah,
it's a bit difficult to maintain that process.
I mean,
so it's not wrong that they did that, but it is a reality.
What you kind of get from getting more into Marxism is that you realize that like revolutionary struggle and furthering the interests of the working class is mainly about the sort of ruthless pragmatism, and not really at all about. I mean, there is an aspect to it because there is a moral imperative within like every socialist ideology to further the interests of the working class, but the way you get there is via very pragmatic means, like your ideas, your values don't play a lot into it, but it's rather more about what is the most effective way to do this, or what is I guess within the area of effective ways to do that, you can look at which one is the more humane, but bottom line is like, how do we get this accomplished by any means necessary?
Yeah. So I forgot what piece this was from. I actually can't pronounce it, if we're being honest. Like Marx said in, there might even be a translated version of it, but it's like Niu Reinst Zeitung. I don't know. I can't speak German. Nonetheless, what he said was like, he was essentially talking to the ruling class in this quote, but what he said was, we will make no excuse for terror.
Yeah.
And I believe that this was after, okay, yeah, so this was a year after the Paris Commune, and people, mostly from the ruling class, were basically like, but they were mean and scary, so that's why the Paris Commune was bad. And he was essentially saying that he doesn't care because that is the truth of how class society has developed over history, and how it maintains itself, is that capitalism had to violently repress the feudal kings and lords of the time, and it also had to violently repress and scare the working class so that it would feel less entitled to revolt. Basically, that the working class was always under a state of terror. And so Marx was essentially like, we will make no excuse for being strict and terrifying.
Yeah,
That
because
if you represent bourgeois class interests, you ain't gonna have a fun time.
yeah, no, that's how you get things done.
Yeah. And so it's mostly an analysis of history, and it is ruthless pragmatism.
Yeah. It is worth pointing out that the person who called us tankies has also at a previous occasion called me a tanky for being a platformist. So I mean, I guess Macno was a fucking tanky.
True.
I guess the Anarchist Federation of Rio de Janeiro were fucking tankies, or are still fucking tankies, as well as the Anarchist Federation of Uruguay.
That is true. That is 100% true.
Yeah, so from this point onward, this podcast is going to be called Tanky and Anarcho-Tank. and we're gonna bring forth our tanky agenda.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah. I have some criticisms from a Swedish anarchist comrade. Even if he could agree with the dialectical analysis to a bit, he doesn't see the utility of it.
Okay, so to an extent, you could say that it's not necessary because it's something that's going to happen one way or another. Yeah, that basically the class struggle is going to happen in history one way or another. And whether you're an anarchist or not doesn't change the fact that it is through this dialectical model that history is being moved forward. So even if you don't accept the model, if you're making that revolutionary change, then that model is still in effect because it's natural, essentially. Yeah. But where it's useful is analyzing the different ways in which it affects your movement, because these things are never isolated into two camps. These things affect all things. So there are opposing forces and there are contradictions in the revolutionary movement itself. And so analyzing dialectics in your own movement is also useful because it can show you how to be more effective. So, for example, if you live in a semi-feudal condition where there are still peasants, you got to talk about the contradictions between the peasantry and the working class. Mm. This is where we get into things like antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradictions, where antagonistic contradictions are things like between the bourgeois and the working class, where the interests are diametrically opposed. There cannot be a middle ground ever. Whereas with the peasantry can be won over to taking the peasantry as a whole, I should say, not just individuals, and because even individuals of the bourgeois can be won over as well. But nonetheless, the peasantry can come to accept the proletarian viewpoint and end up becoming communists rather than being petty bourgeois in their world outlook. So things like that. So dialectics help us understand how to make unities with those who have different interests than we do.
Right.
It helps us understand. Why we shouldn't lose hope when things don't immediately go to plan. It helps us understand why even after the working class seizes power, that everything didn't go smoothly.
Yeah.
So this understanding will always be pushing forward our theory and our practice. Theory and practice cannot be separated. They are, in some ways, and you can look at theory and practice as having having a dialectical relationship where they aren't necessarily always the same. In fact, sometimes they're in conflict with each other. But when we practice it, we must try our very hardest to make sure that there are no divisions between practice and theory.
Right. And I think where a dialectical analysis can be useful is just like, I think there's a certain utility to understanding why certain things under capitalism happens, like understanding crises, or understanding how even say if you aren't in a place where there are actually, I think this is interesting, and I think it's something worth bringing up later, but other groups of people with different class interests other than like bourgeois, peasants, workers, etc. Because I think there's some other stuff to be said there, but we can do that another time. But I think just like deciding how you're gonna structure your movement, even if you don't have to necessarily like unite people with different interests, it can be of a lot of help.
Yeah, it can. Trying to understand where people are coming from in their perspective, yeah, it does help. And it also provides a framework that like makes sense, I guess you could say. And it really solidifies why we fight, because even though it's inevitable, no, it's not actually. I should clarify because that was something that was said earlier. It's not that communism is necessarily inevitable, but that class struggle is inevitable, and all class struggle will, over a long enough period of time, logically lead to a communist society, because that's what communism is sort of defined by.
Unless, I mean, there's the potential of mass extinction type events.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying, though, is that, but like at that point, it's that class struggle is inevitable. So if that's happening, then like there's no class struggle because there's not people.
Yeah.
And so that's why communism isn't necessarily inevitable, because shit like that can happen. But nonetheless, the class struggle in society is always happening, no matter where you are in history, whether you're in slave society, tribal society, or feudal society, or capitalist society, or socialist society. Class struggle is happening. And so that's why, you know, we talk about, when I talk about like inevitability, I'm talking about history constantly being pushed forward by class struggle, even if it doesn't always go in a linear line, which it doesn't, because in every society there are remnants of the old society. And so that old society, depending on what's happening in history, can actually come back, restore, and overthrow the new society. I can't think of any particular examples under capitalism, but we can talk about slave society returning under feudalism, at least in the context of the US, because slavery existed for quite a while beforehand throughout history. In Rome, there was slaves, and in Greece, there were slaves, and yada, yada, yada. But that ended up going away. However, remnants of old society sort of began under feudalism, specifically under the context of colonialism of the Americas. So with the colonialism of the Americas, the remnants of old slave society started to bring themselves back. And then we had the slave trade, and then we had massive amounts of slavery in what would become the United States, and also in the United States, because it happened after the American Revolution as well. So under feudalist tendencies, slavery existed, and then that ended up conflicting with capitalism of the North, because the North was more developed capitalism. And as like, we can get into the specifics of the Civil War, which I could, but in the end, it was a conflict between slave society and capitalist society that ended up in the Civil War and the abolition of legal chattel slavery in the United States. So this is an example of how history sometimes goes back and then back again forward really, really fast. Mm-hmm. Like that was a transition from slavery and or semi-slavery, semi-feudalism without any full feudalist period, because these things are always at play. Everything is constantly in motion, and so sometimes that motion is backwards. But nonetheless, it is class struggle. It's just that the progressive side isn't always winning that class struggle. And
this I mean, I'm pretty sure we could imagine a sort of society where the feudalism would be restored in some capacity due to the material and the economic conditions of the world.
Yes.
But we don't have to get into that.
It's not necessarily useful to imagine that, because until we're there, we really don't know. We can start to see these things as they develop, but as for where we are right now, not a whole lot that we can do to imagine that. But we still do have elements of feudalism in capitalist society, like landlords. Landlords don't necessarily make a whole lot of sense in the context of capitalism or under the logic of how capitalism works. But nonetheless, we have landlords. And so it's integrated itself more and more into capitalism. And then we also have a decent amount of cultural things that come from feudalism. Like some aspects, while not all, of patriarchy are actually rooted in feudalism. And so we see these same aspects much more clearly in societies that remain semi-feudal. I'm going to say the Philippines, because I know a decent amount about that, about the Philippines, is that, a lot of times immigrant parents from peasant backgrounds will want basically their daughters to get married as very soon. And so they kind of struggle with that, where they're they didn't grow up in that feudal society, so they don't have those same interests. But their parents who did grow up in feudal society do. And so they either want them to get married super early and basically maintain that same position in more feudal styles of patriarchy, or they try and have their kids go into the exact same industry as they are, things like that. There are things that exist under capitalism that are really more feudalist than capitalist in final analysis. So there are things like that. But anyways, getting back to the main point about whether or not dialectics is useful, is that, it provides hope. It makes sense for why we fight, because through this analysis of history, we can understand that's a fight that matters.
Yeah.
That's not just a fight that's hopeless.
And
it's definitely not hopeless, because history has moved so far from where it used to be.
Yeah. And I would say having this, I could say, pretty dry philosophical principle to base your ideas on, it does help you to realize what we talked about earlier, that socialism ought to be based on this pragmatic thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's all of the follow-up. So let's get into the main topic of this episode, which is the title of the episode is Building the Party, I think. Quick semantics point. This does not. I have not gone full Marxist-Leninist. This does not necessarily refer to a party in that sense. Malatesta used the word party when referring to his ideal organization, and the Anarchist Federation of Uruguay also referred to themselves as a party back in the 50s. So anarchists do have a history of using the term as well. It's just not very common today. But yeah, you want to start, or should I start?
You go ahead.
Okay. Platformism. Yeah, platformism was first proposed as an idea by the group of Russian anarchists abroad, the group of Russian exiled anarchists abroad, of which Makhno was a part. After sometime after the Ukrainian anarchist experiment, I'm not sure exactly when that was, like 1920 something, and it was basically like I'd imagine that it was a response to the failure of the Free Territory of Ukraine and ideas for improvements. So basically, what they advocated in this document is that organizations should be specifically anarchist. This is all part of like the theoretical unity thing that we'll get to later, but specifically anarchists organizations organized into a federation. This federation has theoretical and tactical unity, and it has every member has responsibility for the actions carried out by the federations. By the federation. The federation also has responsibility for the actions carried out by the individual members and individual groups. The main purpose of this federation is the furtherment of class struggle and eventual transition from capitalism to communism, where sort of controversy comes in with a lot of synthesis type anarchists, and I guess a lot of like syndicalists about a platformist idea, is where this organization is supposed to have some sort of executive committee responsible for like coordination and shit, implementing decisions, monitoring local groups. This is actually one of the more important parts of having an executive committee, I think, is that you have someone monitoring the local groups to ensure that they keep to the agreed upon tactics and the agreed upon theory. And it's not necessarily that this committee has more power than anyone else, or that they can implement whatever decisions they like, but they are responsible for this monitoring and relaying this information to the local groups. It also monitors the state of the movement and like ties all the groups together and keeps up communication between them. So that's basically what platformism is. I think it's not a perfect theory, but I think the general structure is sound, like the idea of a federation with tactical unity and theoretical unity. and this not central committee, this coordination kind of executive committee that keeps things under control, so to speak. So what Especifismo adds to this, and Especifismo is an idea that was first proposed by the Anarchist Federation of Uruguay. They put out a document which was like, its basic principle was that the anarchist movement, and specifically their Anarchist Federation, needs theory. It needs a theory based upon observations of the world, empirical scientific observations of the world and how it works, and an ideology and a practice derived from that theory, which in a lot of ways is kind of similar to a Marxist view of things. They tend not to accept dialectics, but I mean, minor detail, I think, when what we're talking about is organizational structure. But from this analysis, Especifismo developed, and one of its main ideas is the idea of social insertion, which is basically like the idea of their idea is that, again, you should have specifically anarchist organizations with tactical unity, with theoretical unity. But this group is supposed to act as a, I think the term used is an active minority. And the purpose of this active minority or this organization is to partake in social movements, movements of oppressed peoples, in order to influence them through the struggle itself. Not necessarily through propaganda, not necessarily through education, though I would say education is a vital point, as well as propaganda. But the main idea is that the struggle itself is what radicalizes people. It gets people to sort of realize their interests. And that's also, I think, the idea behind organizing or helping with specifically like oppressed people and people who are hit most by capitalism, is that they are their interests are more clearly opposed to those of the bourgeoisie. The Federation is also supposed to, within Especifismo, supposed to sort of like pry away the influence of reactionary movements within these social movements. So you would kind of kick out social democrats or whatever, or fascists would not be accepted. So I mean, I think it's easy to see why this would be a good strategy in places where there are a lot of more oppressed people or people who are hit harder by capitalism than like middle class white people. But that's the general idea of Especifismo and platformism. So you have any questions or ideas on that?
So yeah, no, a decent amount of that makes sense. And really the thing is that there's not too many points that any Maoist would particularly disagree with this model. And this is where a lot of anarchist critiques of it comes from, is that it critiques its similarity to Marxist parties. And that's not incorrect, actually. Is that as Marxism has developed in its current movements, if you look at the most successful of these movements today, this is generally how that model follows. The main distinguishing factor is its ideological basis to move forward.
I think this is kind of like, I want to say the purpose of our podcast, but it's not like our podcast is going to change this in any meaningful way. But I think kind of what we're doing here, what I want to do here, but I know it's not going to happen because society is not changed by the ideas of great men as myself. No, but I think what we're trying to do here is kind of bridge the gap between anarchism and Marxism, and in a way build a movement which can sort of like make people realize that these ideologies don't necessarily have to be all that different. if applied correctly?
So basically, I guess I can go into the Maoist conception of a party and what that can look like. So each example is going to look differently, and we can see this. And the variations that we see all over the world, whether that be Philippines, India, like Canada, Nepal, there are places where this is happening. But I'll again use the Philippines because that's what I'm most familiar with in this particular case. And I can sort of explain how the Communist Party of the Philippines operates, which is sort of a basis for how all Maoists do their organizing. So what the anarchists would call a particular anarchist organization, which brings together people of a particular viewpoint, which is to say the most advanced of the anarchists. And the role of the Communist Party is to lead class struggle, and it does this by so I guess you could call it social insertion, where the Communist Party is made up of people of a particular tendency and discipline. The discipline also matters, so that they can actually do these things effectively. Is that they will put their influence in as much of the social struggle as possible. And sometimes this is by having members of the party sort of insert themselves into the struggle and be sort of that active minority. And sometimes it is by starting mass organizations to actually fill in that role if there isn't much of a social, if there isn't much of a social struggle going on. So, for example, the Communist Party of the Philippines operates and influences the National Democratic Front of the Philippines. And the National Democratic Front, they are a united front of various social organizations, whether that be there are immigrant organizations, there are scientists organizations, there are workers organizations, youth organizations, women's organizations, a bunch of shit, right? And so, yeah, essentially by being the best that they can be, they sort of become the leadership. And so it's not always a formal thing. It's oftentimes that they will present themselves in the movement as best as possible and try and convince people that they are the best, that like they have the best leadership.
I think that in some ways is similar to social insertion.
Yeah, so that's essentially the way that the party works in this case, where it acts as a leading example, and not just through ideology, but like genuine leadership of the struggles. And so it's like this leadership does not, one of the critiques, and this can be used more or less against some than others, is that like the vanguard is a self-appointed, we know everything, but really not any different than an especialismo organization, because it's not that they self-declare being the vanguard or being the leading body of revolutionary struggle, but that they earn that. So basically, you can't just call yourself the leader of the social struggle. You have to lead that social struggle, and you have to have mass support. You have to have people who are willing to trust you and be led by you, and you have to actually be engaged in revolution. So like basically these are things that you earn. These aren't
Yeah.
things that you just claim. Like these, so to be the leading body of the social movement, you know, you can't just say that you are. So sort of that critique can be applied to anarchists as well. But I think that oftentimes anarchists are a little bit better at being modest and not thinking that they're like the shit, whereas oftentimes Marxists do.
Yeah.
So the Communist Party is sometimes, you know, that's always structured differently, depending on where you are. But oftentimes there is a leading body, like an executive committee or a central committee, and this organization operates under democratic centralism, which basically, I think that this is pretty similar to the platformist idea that the individual is responsible for the organization is responsible for the individual. Logical conclusion that that makes is that when a decision is made, you kind of have to go through with it because that's how you maintain its responsibility. Even if you might disagree, if you don't disagree enough to the point where you think that it should be split, then you're going to go through with it, and you're going to continue to struggle, and you're going to continue to struggle, and by struggle I don't mean like necessarily social struggle. I mean ideological struggle within the organization itself. But that unity matters. So at a demonstration, for example, the reason that we couldn't do this last week was because I was at a demonstration for J20, the inauguration of Trump. And I sort of was able to get a better understanding of how some people conduct themselves at demonstrations versus others. So we had the sort of disorganized mass of some anarchists in Black Bloc, and then there was my organization, where we actually had 4 people on security, or actually 4 main security, and then 1 lead security, and that lead security was actually leading our entire contingent. There were times where I disagreed with the particular decision that our lead made, but it would have been a fucking hot mess if I decided to try and make that decision and cause an internal issue. So that's sort of where we are there. Like afterwards we had assessment where we went over what we liked, what we didn't like, and I was able to critique the person who was leading us on the decision, and we were able to struggle over it. And you know, I ended up agreeing with them and agreeing with their decision. But nonetheless, you know, there are times where that might not be the case, where the leader can be like, where the leader in that particular case can be like, okay, no, you're right, cool. And then that will inform them better in the future. And sometimes these roles change. But nonetheless, had I decided to do my own thing based on the decision that I thought was better, it would have been better. It was better for us to stay with the decision that I thought wasn't the best, than to try and cause a shit show by trying to do my own thing.
Okay, so on like assessment stuff, if there was a situation where there was a disagreement between you and this person, but we can imagine another situation too. But say you were right, and say the person in charge of this decision did not agree, and the rest of the organization agreed with you, basically. How would that be dealt with?
Well, I mean, it entirely depends case to case. Like, if the general membership body thinks that it's a big deal that the person who's leading us doesn't agree with this, then they can remove them from their position. It's not a particularly difficult thing to do. But also, if it's like sort of borderline in this case, if the decision can be made, for example, then the general membership can basically veto the decision and instead place in their own, as general membership is almost always the highest body of decision making.
All right.
But if it's like particularly small to the point where general membership doesn't care, and so the disagreement is like not important to the point where they don't feel like going through it, then the decision will just stay, even if it's, in this particular case, it's not the most agreed upon one.
All right. So if you were to have a disagreement with someone, and the general membership of the organization didn't care that much, but you did, what would happen is basically that the decision would be carried through anyway.
Yeah, I mean, like the assessment can go on, and I could try and make my case as hard as I could for why I think it's important, but if it's not something that anyone cares about, then and I can't convince them to care about it, then it clearly doesn't matter that much, or at least I need to really work on my presentation.
Yeah. And I think
so
that
essentially it just wouldn't go through if like I'm just a really loud person who's disagreeing.
Yeah, and that sounds reasonable to me. So I think our main point of disagreement, in a way, and we talked about this. We've talked about this a bit before, is federalism and how universally applicable it is, or I don't know if that's the right term for this, but how widely used it ought to be.
Okay. Can you make your case?
Yeah. Okay. So I think I would say federalism is a preferable way to structure your organization, because the local people in a specific area are going to be the ones who know how to tackle their specific situation. They're going to be more familiar with the material conditions of that particular place. That's the basic argument. I think there's more to it, but I would also say that it helps to have this sort of very universal democracy within the organization, where every local group has the same authority on issues that concern the entire federation. So say that doesn't mean that you can't allocate or delegate certain roles to specific local groups. Like if we take the Swedish Syndicalist Youth Federation as an example, you would have local groups that would work as the propaganda committee, or you would have one responsible for the magazine of the organization, and you'd also have like a coordination group. But the fact remains that all decisions taken that concern the organization as a whole are taken on a democratic basis, where one group gets one vote. And I think that's good to make sure that, I guess, different interests don't develop in different local groups, or that one interest that isn't universal to the entire organization takes over. Say if you have a national organization in a specific country, doesn't really matter where, you're going to have like rural groups that are going to have their specific interests, and then you're going to have the more urban city groups that are going to have other interests. And in most cases, I feel like the if you would have like a central committee, that would probably the group responsible for that would be in a city, and their interests would kind of win out. Or yeah, you see what I'm saying?
I kind of see where you're coming at. So it's not that I would disagree entirely. I think that This sort of has the idea that whatever central leading body would be in a particular area, and this isn't necessarily true depending on the specific conditions and what is needed to face that at the time. However, the actual central leading body wouldn't necessarily all come from the same place. In
Right.
fact, they would not. They would be representatives.
Right. Yeah, I think that makes that makes it better. I don't necessarily think that it's still an ideal option because you're still going to have the interests of these specific members superseding the interests of the general group.
Right, and so what's needed there is transparency and a constant application of assessment of the decisions that are made. So basically, this is a constantly flowing and constantly moving process that means that there are people that each branch must discuss what they see, say, a central committee or an executive committee doing, and they must discuss, make decisions themselves, and bring that back to the representative. Because while the general membership should always be the highest decision-making body, general membership cannot be expected to take on as many responsibilities. Basically,
Right.
if the higher up you are, the more dedicated you have to be. Regular general membership won't be going to meetings every week, and then, say, executive committee, in the case of my organization, we'll be going to meetings every week, and then if you're national member, executive committee, and then higher up, basically you better be on your shit 24/7.
Right.
Not everyone's willing to do that, and some are, but some aren't qualified. So essentially, the role of making sure that your representative of your organization is representing your organization or your branch of the organization is entirely the job of the general membership to keep among itself. So what's necessary is transparency and communication, essentially.
All right. So I have. Would you say before I ask you another question or ask you to make a case of something, I would like to hear your thoughts about this idea. What do you would you say that it's good to have like term limits for people in these central committees or executive committees?
As in that they can only be there for so long?
Yeah, or only be there for so long without a break. Say they can only sit for like a set number of years in a row.
No, I don't think that's. I mean, in some cases it can be, but that entirely depends. That is something that can be discussed organization to organization based on what they see as being necessary to confront the issues that they see.
Right.
Whether this be objective, like to the local conditions, or that be subjective based on the ideas of the people who are there. So each branch might set this up differently, and that's okay. But I would say generally, no. Some people are just objectively more qualified to carry out certain roles, and they shouldn't be forced to take away from, like, that shouldn't be forced to be taken away for whatever reason.
Right.
Because if someone's qualified to do that, then they should be doing that.
I would say that maybe, and obviously this isn't like a universal rule, but I think that maybe their ability to do this job could potentially like decrease as a function of time, because there are things that being in a leadership position, there are effects that can have on you and your ability to make qualified decisions.
Right, and I don't think that this does have an effect on some amount of them. I agree. And this is the necessity of constant assessment and communication, because the assessment and communication between those under that person and those people is that they are constantly kept in check, essentially. And not
Right.
only this, but part of putting someone in that position is knowing or is making sure that that person not only is qualified to do said job, but is also qualified to assess themselves,
Right.
so that they can notice, so that not only can the others notice and criticize this and try and reform this if possible, but that the individual can as well, so that this, again, is a constantly flowing process.
Okay. So could you make your case for the sort of like formal leadership structure?
Yeah, so the main reason that I generally think that formal leadership is an okay thing is that as someone who has been an anarchist for a while before I was a Maoist, I know that I've seen, and as someone who does mass work, and for mass organizations, the organization structure is almost identical to anarchist organizations. So basically what we see happen when there is no formal leadership is that de facto leadership forms, like almost always. I would say always, actually, in what I've seen. I haven't seen every example, though, so I can't say that for sure. But in every single case that I have seen, de facto leadership forms. The problem with de facto leadership is that they are much more difficult to keep accountable. Right? So when you're like official leadership, then it's like, okay, you're expected to assess yourself this many times and criticize whatever position errors that you make more harshly. You're expected to be on top of your shit 24/7. Whereas a general member, you're not necessarily going to be expected to assess and criticize yourself quite as harshly. And you don't need to be on top of your shit 24/7. You know, you can be more casual. So by having like formal leadership, as opposed to de facto leadership, a de facto leader is expected to do exactly the same amount of self-criticism and criticism as any other member. However, because de facto leadership is still a form of leadership, those like kind of corrupting issues that leadership can often have are not given the same analysis. So
Right.
they're not given this, like, it's more difficult to make sure that, you know, those corrupting factors that leadership positions can sometimes have will often sneak through easier.
Right.
Because there aren't the same barriers set in place.
Yeah, and that doesn't true, and I think there's well, the phrase "power corrupts" is not necessarily entirely accurate, since I would probably say that it's more the feeling of power that corrupts, or the illusion, or
Yeah.
actual power. The thing though with this that I would say as a counter argument or something like that is that I would say that you can have these things even with, say you have, like, as platformism advocates an executive committee.
Mhm.
This executive committee is going to have responsibilities outside of general membership, but it's also going to have general membership along with it. And the local groups should be like very suspicious of, not suspicious, but very critical of the executive committee. And the executive committee is supposed to be like on top of their shit, but they don't have this formal decision-making power. They don't have the power to overrule local decisions or like veto stuff. I'm not sure how a central committee within.
Okay, so
but
a central committee is not allowed to veto general membership. Again, general membership is always the highest decision-making body. So
Right.
really, the differences are really marginal. again, this sort of comes back to leadership is earned.
Mhm.
Like, if the general membership isn't following your leadership, then you're not a leader.
Right.
You know. So, yeah. So they can't. General membership cannot have decisions overruled ever, really, because they are the highest decision-making body. And so the more philosophical thought behind this is that if you're overturning their stuff, then clearly you're not doing a very good job of leading them, because if you were doing a very good job of leading them, then they wouldn't be making these decisions that you think are super important to overturn.
I think
You know?
I think maybe a better way of viewing what I'm trying to say is like, let's see it this way instead. A central committee could make a decision, right? And that decision would go through if it didn't meet any objections from the general membership. Would that be correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think the difference here is that an executive committee in a platformist organization can't do that. It can propose a decision. It can say that we should do this, but that then goes through a vote in the entire federation. And local groups can also do that. They can also send propositions for decisions to the executive committee, which would then distribute or arrange a vote for this.
Mm.
It's just more of like a thing where you ensure that every local group really is okay with it, and I think that sort of can empower them, and I think that can lead to a more critical view of the executive committee. Because I feel like if you have a decision-making body like the central committee, you're not as likely to think over your views of a certain decision as opposed to an executive committee in a platformist organization.
Okay, so I guess the way that I would put it is that, at least for the mass organization that I belong to, is that general membership meetings are twice a month, and then those also serve partly as EC executive committee membership meetings, and then we also have 2 more of those a month. So essentially, we're meeting almost every week. Then EC members also have responsibilities when we communicate outside of meetings to basically always be on top of your shit. Basically, if we wanted to, as the EC, only suggest things, that would require that we only make decisions twice a month, which is difficult.
Yeah.
And so we do keep our decision making pretty much to a minimum. We mostly just carry out day-to-day tasks as the EC, right? So I'm just gonna start abbreviating EC as executive committee and GM as general membership for now, and then CC as central committee. Basically, I guess the way to explain things. Okay, go ahead.
Is this regarding like a local thing, or is this a national thing?
Okay, so I guess the way that I can put it is CC, Central Committee, is national, EC is local, and then GM is also local.
Okay.
So, but the way that the CC functions in comparison to the branches is essentially the same relationship that the EC has towards the GM.
Okay.
So the EC will make decisions, but generally these decisions for the most part have nothing to do with like the actual organizational structure. It mostly has to do with like, day-to-day stuff is for how we carry out campaigns. Like, are we going to flyer at this event? Well, that's something that the EC is mostly going to talk about, and then we'll ask, who the GM, like, hey, we want to do this, and that is happening in a week. We just learned about this. Which one of you can table at this event and flyer for us? So that's one example of how it would work out in practice. So yeah, you can't necessarily make all of those decisions all the time, and it would be very difficult to only use the GM to do this, because the any general membership member can like go to the EC, which isn't like an official, like super official thing that you would just go to a member that they know and be like, hey, heard about this event that's happening. I think that we should flyer at it. And then that's probably a good idea. And then if it's decided that they can go through with it and like set up a table at an event, and then they do that.
Okay, I think the way a way to get around this issue of like only being able to take or to make decisions twice a month is to, and I don't know how secure this is. It's probably not secure. It's probably not a good idea, but the way it's been done in, say, the Syndicalist Youth Federation, and just as an aside here, the Syndicalist Youth Federation of Sweden is not a platformist organization, and I have many criticisms that I could make of it against it, but we're not going to go into that now. But I think, like, the way the Syndicalist Youth Federation has dealt with this is basically having a lot of voting be electronic.
Yeah, no, for sure. The EC does that quite often, and we do that with the general membership as well. However, you will notice that general membership is much less responsive, and that's because they aren't they aren't expected to. Like, us being on top of our shit 24/7 doesn't mean that we are meeting like every day. I mean, we do, not literally every day, but like, you know, we'll often meet one-on-one with GM, or we keep each other in check. We check up on each other and shit like that.
Right.
But you know, we do have to communicate, and we do communicate with the general membership, and so people can suggest things. However, we should also recognize that the EC is always going to be more responsive because they're expected to be, and that's part of the responsibility that they accept when they accept the position, right? So
what I think is, like, if you do have an electronic vote going out to the GM, I would just have that function on the principle that if you don't vote, your vote doesn't count, and then the people vote. It's
for sure that is the case. For sure that is the case. However, that then runs into another problem of the fact that some people are just available at different times. And so when certain votes, when someone isn't responsive to a vote and they, you know, actually have a legitimate reason, then that can cause some issues.
Right, but I also don't I don't think that necessarily is I don't think that's as big of a problem as it could be presented as. Like, if you have a meeting with say some sort of executive committee, that it would function the same. Like, you wouldn't wait if someone is not available for like a week or 2 weeks. You wouldn't wait till that person can come back before you have a meeting. You would have a meeting in their absence, and their votes would not count.
For sure. I mean, like, you need to always account for whatever particular issues and challenges you face. But nonetheless, decisions need to be made. And so when if a decision needs to be made in a day, for example, because the tabling is coming up in a week, and you need to know whether or not to table. Right. Yeah, you can go to the GM and be like, hey, should we do this? And then, you know, you get a few responses, hopefully. It's actually a lot more difficult to get responses than it seems oftentimes, and it's kind of frustrating, but that's what we have to deal with. and you get a feel for it, and when you get a feel for it, you can make that decision. Like it's not a rigid thing necessarily.
I think the way
You
you
know.
can do that is just like send out the question, like, or like rather send out the vote, like be like, you have this much time because we are in a hurry.
Mhm.
Send us your votes, and then you get those votes, and then you count those votes in with the votes within the EC. And
But you know that always depends situation to situation. So in the case of tabling, we actually generally do talk to the general membership about this because we can, and it's not hard to do so. And that's mostly just getting a feel. So it's, you know, not everything has to be particularly like polled and decided and whatnot. But say there's a group chat, and there is, you'd be like, hey, this is a thing. I think that we should go to it, and then we would, uh, because by putting it out there, we try and see. By putting it out there, we open ourselves up to criticism.
right,
You know, and so we do. Again, depending on the situation, communicate as openly as possible, and basically, hey, should we do this? This seems pretty solid. I can't really think of anything. And then the general membership can actually criticize, and they do. And so we have changed decisions based on this communication.
I think one way to do this that would still, I think it would still qualify within like anarchist issues. I'm not necessarily talking about exactly the same thing, and I think it's the situation you have where you are and the organization you're in is very different to the situation I'm in. Since I'm in a kind of rural area, there are not a lot of people, etc. But I think the way you could deal with this is basically outline what sort of decisions should be made through a democratic decision requiring like votes from all members, and which decisions are easier to make, like that you can make without votes from all members, like in your
Yeah, that's
organizational bylaw or something.
yeah, no, that is in our bylaws and in our constitution.
Right.
That is something that we discuss all the time, as a matter of fact. So, as part of this like constant moving machine is constantly adapting ourselves to what we need to do. If we have issue with something, then we bring it up. And so, like, trying to figure out which decisions should be made with which people in mind, or with which decision-making body, that's something that is constantly being changed. That is something that is constantly being addressed, discussed, and adapted. Because you're always like you're constantly facing different issues, and so there's no rigid structure that can answer any of these questions. This is something that must always be discussed.
Right.
And so the discussion is the key factor here.
Right. I think we're talking about a sort of formal leadership that can make decision without the formal approval of every member. I think this is more useful to talk about on a national level rather than on a local level, because I
Okay.
feel like on a local level we're more or less agreed. I think like this sort of say an executive committee is more permissible on a local level. I think on a national level or a federal level, I think I don't really see why a committee should be able to make these decisions without it going through every local group. I think that it's a reasonable requirement for that to happen.
Well, some of this comes back to trust in some cases, because some of them will be ideological decisions, like which ideological line do we want to take. And depending on the type of organization, for example, some mass organizations, if the mass base is actually pretty broad, then that means you have people of all stripes being there in the general membership. And so part of what is necessary is that trust be built, right? So that you can actually carry out effective ideological leadership in some cases. So in my organization, we actually have some people who are pretty liberal. You know, we got a couple Bernie bots and shit like that. But despite this, they trust us, and we've earned that trust, but they do trust us that, like, we know what we're talking about when we talk about our politics. And that, and so this isn't like some like paternal relationship where it's like, oh, well, they know best. This is something that is constantly discussed. Like, we have educational discussions all the time at every meeting, as a matter of fact.
I just feel like,
and that's actually my position.
Yeah, I just feel like in a national organization, you're not gonna have like a local group that is where the majority of the members are, say, liberals, so that their vote can count against like a certain.
Well, no, not the majority for sure. Those are generally new members.
Right. So I don't necessarily think that is much of an issue either. But when it comes to like trust, I think that trust is obviously important for a group, for a leadership group. But it can also sort of like obscure the criticism aimed at, like, you have to be critical of the leadership, obviously.
Yeah, for sure.
From all sides from all member groups. Yeah, and I would probably say that this critical side is probably a bit more important than the trust side of it all.
I agree. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree that the critical side should always take primacy over the trust side. I 100% agree with that. But it's also definitely a balancing act. It is something that is in motion, I should say. One, the trust is earned. And then two, the criticism and the ability to criticize is something that more advanced membership must teach. And so that's, you know, my role actually is the educational officer. So what this means is that I basically have a responsibility to maintain the educational line of the organization.
Okay.
Right? Because we can't like change, especially since we're connected to a national and even international organization, we can't just suddenly change our political line, but it can be critical. So it's a balancing act between, like, so they trust that I know what I'm talking about when I talk about my politics and when I talk about like educating them on what this means. But by presenting the criticism, if I internalize that criticism well, then my critical position will also have an influence, as will all the other EDs, educational discussion officers across the organization will have that influence in discussing the political line.
Right.
Right.
Would you say that they're going back to the trust thing? Would you say that there is a contradiction between this trust that needs to be maintained and having this sort of requirement that all local groups formally agree to a specific, not all groups, but a majority of local groups agree to a decision made by, say, an executive committee?
No, I would say that the two are necessary for each other. I would say that if people aren't agreeing with your decisions, that you clearly haven't earned trust. If
Right.
people aren't agreeing with, and this is why it's a balancing act. Like if you're making decisions that people are disagreeing with, then your organization will function poorly because you don't have a good relationship with your general membership. And so part of the, I guess, accountability of like higher ups, I guess you could say, is that if they don't maintain this, that their organization is going to go to shit.
Right.
You know, you can't have an organization that is making decisions that its general membership doesn't want. Otherwise, they're going to leave, and they do. So that's it's the responsibility of anyone in any position of power to be constantly in this process of rectifying and discussing issues with everyone below them, so that they can constantly have the best relationship with them that they can. So this sort of, you know, when I go back to it being a balancing act, you have to have this balance between ideological leadership, because the people who will be higher up are going to be people who know what they're talking about more for the most part. And so in that case, in that sense, you know, they kind of have a responsibility to be the people to go to when you don't know what to do, because, you know, they practice it and they study it and all that, which everyone does, but they have a more rigid responsibility for this. And so that's one part of it. And then the other part that's necessary is maintaining a good relationship with them. So if you're constantly making decisions that they disagree with, then that relationship's going to fall apart. So it's sort of, it comes back to a balancing act between making sure that you're constantly making the right decision and constantly making sure that you have a good relationship with the general membership. And oftentimes those things go together very well, but sometimes they won't. And so that's where that's where the responsibility of maintaining a good relationship is a balance.
Right. What I'm talking about, though, is like a formal agreement of a majority of local groups. That is like that you actually put each decision to a vote. Like, would you say that is contradictory to the building of trust and the role of the executive committee?
No, because I think that whatever decisions you make, if they are made well, that the general membership is going to notice that, right? So I think seeing what you're saying. What I'm saying is that like
I used the word executive committee. I should probably have used the word central committee.
Oh, word. Okay. So if basically you're saying that you're talking about if the CC makes a decision without necessarily going to every branch.
Yeah, I think, is there a contradiction between a decision made by the CC going up for a vote, like necessarily going up for a vote every time they make a decision, it goes up for a vote? Would you say there's a contradiction between that and their role in the organization?
No, not necessarily. Again, always depends situation to situation. It's their job to, you know, maintain that relationship.
Right.
But part of the reason that you can't necessarily have every decision that that the CC goes with be put up to general vote is that sometimes there will be things that have to do with very, very, very long, say documents, for example. Basically, so if you want to say that you want to take up a particular like ideological line, and someone wrote a book about said thing, do you expect that the general membership is going to read that book? Because I don't, and I'm probably not going to read that book. So if you want to uphold whatever ideological pieces are made by said book and using that said book as an official document, I can expect that the CC is going to like actually read it thoroughly, whereas say if it's down to general membership, that it's going to be much more summed up.
Yeah, and
Right.
I definitely agree with that to a point, but I think it's still useful to like sum these ideas up in like say just like an email or something going out to every member organization,
Okay.
and then
So
going through a vote. Like,
so basically this comes down to super broad versus super specific. So if it's summed up, there can be like two different documents that can follow the guidelines of whatever is summed up, but are still different in some ways, even if it comes down to like really nitpicky things, like which words you decide to use and shit like that. So even if it's summed up, like going back to the whole balancing act thing, you got to make sure that the general membership agrees with the outline. If it comes down to a decision or a discussion based off of specific words, you're not going to go to the general membership about that, because that's not only is that it's annoying to be a general member and just be like, should we or should we not use the word scientific in this sentence? They don't give a fuck. Nobody gives a fuck.
it's
For the most part.
When I was part of the Syndicalist Youth Federation, I did attend one national like Congress meeting,
Mhm.
and one of the questions brought up was, should we, in our Declaration of Principles, should we replace the word homophobia with LGBTQ phobia? And that doesn't seem like a decision that necessarily needs to be taken on a level including every member organization.
Yeah.
I think you could do
So
that by having a
that
specifically responsible for that, and
yeah, you can.
that
And
I think that's still in line with anarchism in a way.
so you can, and so it all depends on
Or it's still in line
the
with
situation at hand.
federalism, I should say.
I mean, it is in that federalism is actually a pretty flexible thing.
Yeah.
Right. And so, like, when I talk about mass organizations, like, yeah, for the most part, they do follow that method. They follow federalism almost to a T. Where some minor disagreements go is like, yeah, things like that need to be maintained. And then it comes back to the balancing act. Like, if the general membership does feel like those decisions should be made by them, then they'll bring that up. And so it being a process is going to be something that it's going to be something that changes, which means that you're going to make mistakes. It's impossible not to make mistakes, but the important part is rectifying those mistakes. So if they were like, hey, I would have liked to have had a say in that decision, then that will be taken into account, and that will influence them in the future on trying to balance out being obnoxious and being inclusive. Right. So yeah, and if they fail at that balancing act, then the organization is going to fail.
Right.
So like they'll notice if they're like, hey, I keep on bringing up that there are decisions being made that I would have otherwise had a say in. If that's constantly a thing that's being brought up and it's not a thing that's ever being addressed, then the organization is going to fail because there isn't a good relationship between anybody and the general membership. So that's where it's an actual responsibility to make sure that you're maintaining a proper balance between which decisions are brought up to who.
Right. I keep kind of coming back to this idea that in most cases, sending out like an email to every local group. If you're part of a CC, I think sending out an email to every local group and saying, "Hey, you should vote on this issue." I don't think that is necessarily that hard of a thing to do, and I think it is useful in a lot of ways. And if you don't get any votes, or if you get like just a couple of votes, I don't think that's necessarily that big of a problem because you can still make the decision.
I guess the question at that point is time and the situation. So if you're trying to make a decision and you send that out, is like, okay, now do you wait? Say there's a CC meeting, because these things typically will happen in meetings, even if they aren't, day-to-day stuff is constantly happening. But if they're happening at an actual meeting, then meetings are times of like rapid productivity.
Yeah.
Right. What do you do while you're waiting? Right. Do you start like talking about other, like what other decisions you want to make? You can, but it will also be pretty difficult to, in a way that really justifies it, talk about which issues came up in the discussion of trying to make said decision, like what criticisms do people have and things like that. And that can be done through an email in some cases. But in some cases that will also be really, really difficult to follow, because if you got a bunch of people being like, they're going to be asking questions constantly. And that's fine. That's a good thing, because questions will help you maintain a better understanding, and with that, a better relationship between general membership. But nonetheless, and unless you're willing to have that meeting go really, really slow as you're sending out emails to get responses back from general membership, they're not really going to be carried out effectively.
I think the idea,
but again, it's always a balancing act, and that balancing act will always be like everything must be taken into consideration. If it's proper for the time, then it's proper for the time. But a lot of the time, it really isn't.
I think an idea in a lot of anarchist federations is, if you have a committee like this, it would propose. It would think of like, okay, we're gonna propose these decisions, and then the decisions are like, then you send the emails out. You wait till the next meeting you have, and then you would count the votes you'd gotten by then. You have a specific deadline in the email, and then you look through the emails and see like the votes, and then I can see how it's not as effective, but I also think, yeah, like if we were talking about balancing acts, I think you have to balance sort of effectivity with maintaining a sort of democratic structure in the organization. And I also I think if you have specific if there are specific time constraints that you have to adhere to, that don't allow you to have these long discussions or long waits, that's things you can clarify. You can delegate that power to an executive committee in certain cases, or a central committee in certain questions, or when the situations require it. And I think you can clearly and concretely outline when that is required. But yeah, that's my idea. I don't necessarily disagree with this issue of effectivity, but I think it should be applied to specific cases, and I think in most cases it's useful for the decisions to go through a national democratic vote.
You mentioned like clear outlines of when such decisions would be delegated. However, I think that oftentimes with constantly changing situations, that it is almost impossible to constantly understand when these decisions should be delegated. And so that is part of why this is constantly a balancing act in any process. So the people in the EC or the CC would have to, this goes back to them having the responsibility to maintain a good relationship with general membership.
Right. Well, I think then.
So I don't think that it's actually necessarily super practical to have clear outlined ideas about which decisions. In some cases, yes, and that should be in the bylaws in the Constitution. However, even a bylaw or constitution cannot account for every single decision or type of decision that can come up. And so that is where we go back to responsibility of maintaining a relationship and a responsibility of maintaining productivity.
My response to that would be that these outlines, they can be like very broad. They can be very descriptive of the not very descriptive. They can like ask to have them like remain practical.
Mm-hmm.
And they can like just having the words
Right.
if the
So
situation requires it due to time constraints.
right. So the thing is that even things like time constraints have to be interpreted. So basically, the only things that you have to particularly outline, that you can actually, is which decisions must be made by general membership or which decisions must be delegated to a higher decision-making body. And then everything else, like, you can delegate that, and that's entirely possible. And then everything else is what must be interpreted. So when you go back to being really broad, like, that's not incorrect, but being broad does necessarily leave gaps where things must be interpreted, and that's fine. But that is a truth. So people have to constantly be checking in on themselves to figure out which is applicable to that time. So there are things that can rigidly be decided or rigidly must be decided on a general membership basis, which is, again, the highest decision-making body. However, everything that is not within that must be interpreted, and that is part of the responsibility that certain rules are given.
I mean, I would agree that this does require interpretation. I still think the words, if it is required due to time constraint, would be useful to have in your bylaws. But yeah, I do agree that this requires interpretation. I would prefer, if I was part of an organization, I would prefer that national votes on decisions was the rule rather than like the what's it called? The exception. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, then that goes back to trust. Like, if that is how the general membership feels, and like as you're saying that you would prefer it, well, if you would prefer it, then you bring it up, and if you bring it up, and other people agree with you, then as a matter of responsibility of maintaining a good relationship between general membership and anybody else, then they will adopt that. However, if depending on the particular situation, like, for example, if state repression is particularly harsh during a particular time, during a month or a year, they might not feel that is necessary. They might feel that they want to focus more on maintaining their roles a little bit more rigidly. Then they'll bring that up. So that goes back to the responsibility of maintaining a good relationship, because if the general membership feels that it should be the general rule but not the exception, and that other exceptions can exist, then that will be the case, because as the higher decision-making body, they can bring that up and they can struggle over it and they can make it happen. So
I just feel like
it just depends on how the general membership feels at the time. If they want national, like, very broad decision-making to be the rule, then they'll make it so.
I just want to add, like, I don't think that it should be the rule because that would be like personal preference, because I don't think that because I would like to be part of the decision-making process necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
I think what it can do, if you have that as the rule and have that formally outlined as the rule, that would sort of foster like this democratic culture, if you will, within the organization, which I think is I think it's necessary for people to have that mindset and to have that critical outlook. And I think it increases the propensity for people to have this critical outlook if they are constantly part of the decision making process.
So you are right that things like fostering a more democratic culture within the organization, that is a thing that happens and people notice it. So it's a thing that is good to have. However, I think that in this case, it's really more about, like, if the democratic culture, I guess, is the best way to operate and is the most satisfactory towards membership, then it is their main responsibility to maintain it, right? But not only is it their responsibility to maintain it, it's also actually higher leadership's responsibility to push it and develop it. And the reason that they would, rather than trying to be greedy and keeping it to themselves, is that they understand that the more they do that, the better the relationship is, right?
Okay.
And so organizations that don't do that, that don't have like sort of higher functioning bodies always pushing for the general membership to see itself as the highest decision-making body, they fail. They don't actually work. They don't develop quite as well. It's more difficult for them to recruit, So it's part of just being a good organization, and it's part of just constantly developing the general membership and the organization to have that role be something that is somewhat pushed. Because something that I've noticed is that new members will never feel confident to make a decision, even when it's brought to them. So even if you have it in a particular bylaw or your consi or whatever, without people who are expected to be on top of their shit, like the EC and the CC, pushing that they be more active in the decision-making body, then they can't maintain that relationship. And so it's actually very difficult for the EC or CC to do their job without actually maintaining that the general membership actually internalizes the fact that they are the general decision-making body. So it is better for the general decision-making body to have the most influence that it can, right?
Yeah.
However, that is something that must be internalized by them themselves, and that is a difficult thing to do.
I just think that one way that you could get people to internalize this and to push this is to have these national decisions be made, or these federal decisions be made. Like, the way I would see it work is you have these decisions, they get sent out from a CC to the local groups, and the local groups vote on them via votes from the membership. And I feel like if you have these very or these regular votes, I think that's one way to make people more comfortable with making decisions.
Well, I mean, basically the way that I would respond to that is that well, if it works, then do it. And that's really the best way that I can put it, is that and this applies to the entire way that we do things, is that if that does work as a way to make sure that they internalize their role better, then do it. But if that isn't the case, which sometimes it might not be, sometimes it might, then don't.
Yeah, and
So
that goes back to the entire issue of Marxism being being like more oriented towards an empirical
Like ruthless pragmatism.
yeah, and like observing what actually happens in the real world instead of what happens in your own rational head.
I guess, yeah, part of the balancing act is like it really just goes back to if it works, then do it. If it doesn't, then don't. But you can't. That is something that will be constantly developed. It will not be something that will ever be forever rigid in structure because conditions will always change. Your decision, your general membership might be full of people who really understand their politics, and then it might be full of people who aren't. And so that's constantly, it will be full of people who are confident in their decision making. It will be full of people who are not constant or who are not confident in their decision making. So you just have to interpret it. If it works, do it.
I think what this, the result of this conversation is like, surprisingly, as always, not really surprisingly, our views are in a lot of ways very similar.
Mhm.
And there's not really a lot to discuss. It's just like most of it tends to come down to what works best in what situation.
Yeah.
I guess where there potentially might lie a disagreement would be on like democratic centralism, but I don't know. Could you talk a bit about that?
So, for example, for cadre organization, the cadre organization is best compared to the like platformist, particular anarchist organization where it's
like a party or something.
Yeah. Where basically you have to be a communist and be willing to be disciplined, right? In order to be a part of it. And, like especifismo platformist organizations are the same, where like you have to be an anarchist and you have to be willing to be put to work.
Right.
And then social insurgent. And then social, what's up?
Yeah, that's something they emphasize a lot, that it's about like you need I think the term they use is dedicated militants.
Yeah. So to use the anarchist phrasing to explain ours, the organization of the dedicated militants versus the mass organization. So the dedicated militants in the anarchist context insert themselves through social insertion into social struggles to influence them. Whereas with us, we actually have where that social insertion is happening, like be particular organizations, and those organizations are mass organizations, where you can be of pretty much like where it's multi-tendency. Basically, if you hold progressive politics that are in line with however broad the particular organization is, then you're free to be a member.
Right.
How broad the actual politics can be of the mass organization changes from organization to organization, but nonetheless, they exist. So for the mass organization, where discipline isn't quite as rigid and the ideological unity also isn't quite as rigid, that is where being democratic takes place the most, where broad discussion and broad decision making is primary all the time. Like if you're going to make a decision, the rule rather than the exception is that everyone talks about it and in the most democratic way possible, right? And then for an actual cadre organization, or in the anarchist context, dedicated militant organization, centralism takes primacy. Since there's already stronger discipline and stronger ideological unity, it's less necessary to have like really broad decision making all the time, because like sometimes there will be, but for the most part, given that they're already disciplined and have strong ideological unity, there aren't going to be as many disagreements, right? There aren't going to be quite as many differing political opinions or different lines on certain situations.
Right.
When there is, you struggle it out and come to a conclusion. But, this goes entirely back to the other discussion that we just had. And in that sense, going to the discipline part of discipline and unity is that when a decision is made, it is carried out in a united way. So really, like, democratic centralism in this sense basically means democratic discussion and then centralized action, right?
Okay.
So a mass organization would be more likely to, since democracy is primary over centralism, things like, say, diversity of tactics is more applicable, where like there might be disagreements on particular tactics and people are more flexible to carry those out as individuals or as branches,
Right.
Whereas with the actual cadre organization, the diversity of tactics is not really very strongly applied. So instead there's strong unity of tactics where, like, okay, well, we're going to do this and we're going to do this. There's still democracy and discussion, going back to just democracy and discussion, centralism and action. But the discipline and ideological unity means that you're going to carry things out in an agreed upon way.
Right.
Whereas with mass organizations, some people might disagree. Like some parts of the organization might disagree with what other parts of the organization are doing, and that is more permitted than it would be in a cadre organization. So mass organization, democracy, there is still a centralist aspect to it where, depending on the situation, stronger unity and action can happen. Again, this goes once again right back to the discussion that we just had. But there are a lot more flexible options, and there are a lot more provisions that can be made to make things more democratic.
I've like when I have thought myself, when I've talked with anarchists about democratic centralism or heard conversation about democratic centralism, what it has been described as has basically been like when you make a decision, or my idea of it has been like when a decision is made, it's carried out, and you keep to that. And like I never really understood what was so bad about that.
So it really just depends on how it is applied. Like you'll see like some organizations that use democratic centralism basically as a way to hide the fact that they made a decision. It's like, why did you make this decision? They'll be like, democratic centralism. It's like, that's not an answer. I'd like to know why democratic centralism led to that decision. And so oftentimes, so I can see where some anarchists are coming from in that sense, where some like Leninist organizations will basically use it to not be accountable.
Right. They feel like, yeah, okay.
But that's an improper application of it. So a proper application of it would be discussion, decision, carrying it out, and then assessment. Right? So you democracy and discussion, and then you decide, and then you carry it out, and then you carry it out. When a decision is made, you do carry it out, and then you can assess it. that is and then that assessment will influence the discussion and decision next time.
Right.
Right. So yeah, to put it pretty briefly, it is carrying out a decision that is made, but more provisions to deviate from the particular decision are allowed, depending on the context, or, for example, in a mass organization.
And you can also
Right.
like imagine a situation where this decision could be changed at a later point after, like through another.
That's assessment. Yeah, that's what assessment's for.
Mm.
The assessment part is figuring out whether or not it's an actually effective decision.
Right.
So the decision can be changed, and that's what assessment's for. But when it's time to carry it out, you do, especially if it's something that's a pretty, like, it's something that you can't stop and discuss. Like if it's something that has to do with say an action at a street demo, like, okay, how do we want to do our security, or how do we want to confront this particular situation that we might face,
Right.
or whatever. Like, if suddenly halfway through the march you're like, you know what, I disagree with this, that's going to be difficult, because you're going to have to pull off to the side, have a discussion, and then carry that decision through. And that does happen. In fact, last thing that I went to, we pulled off multiple times, and we discussed with each other and what we wanted to do next. But not every decision can work that way. And also, you can't, when you disagree in the middle of it, if you don't have the time to have the discussion, you shouldn't break off and, go with your decision anyways.
Yeah.
Right. So when I was talking about the time that I disagreed, I disagreed with someone who made a decision, and I was able to bring this up during assessment.
Mm.
And then we discussed it, and we ended up agreeing upon it. However, I was not able to change that decision exactly when I started to disagree with it. And instead, I decided to follow through anyways, even knowing that I disagreed to a degree. And sometimes there can be times where it actually is right to make the decision yourself and split off from the particular decision that was made earlier. But that depends situation to situation and how serious that disagreement actually is.
Yeah.
So in this case, I said to myself, all right, I disagree with the decision that's being carried out, but I also understand that it's being carried out, and that it would be better for me to remain disciplined and maintain the unity than to make my own decision in that case. And then we can discuss it later. And then we were able to discuss it later, and then I ended up changing my mind. Right.
Yeah, I think
so,
in a way
go
it's
ahead.
a good rule to have, that you have democracy in your planning and in your theoretical stuff, and in like very like non-intense situations. But then if you're like out on the field, so to speak, it's more important to stick to your plans, and unless your plans are entirely like detrimental to what you're doing.
Yeah, and so when it becomes detrimental and difficult to do, then that's when it's the responsibility of the individual to make that apparent and address it.
Yeah. So in this episode, we went over some comments made on previous episodes. We talked a little bit about intersectionality and class reductionism as counter to identity reductionism or identity politics. And we addressed some stuff from the anarcho-communism group, mainly the fact that we are both confirmed tankies. And then we went over organizational structure, platformism, and especificismo as counter to Maoist mass organizations and cadre organizations. And we went a little bit into democratic centralism. I would also like to mention that we have a Gmail account set up for this podcast. It's anarchomao@gmail.com. Anarchomao, no spaces, no hyphens, @gmail.com. There you can send criticisms of this episode or any other episode we have, but preferably the latest one. And you can also suggest topics, I guess, criticisms of Marxism or Maoism or anarchism, and we'll bring them up in the next episode. And until next time, remember, you have nothing to lose but your chains. Bam.
Bam.
Okay, I'm gonna hit stop now.